you know, our Congress likes to make an emergency out of everything. So they let everything go to the very last minute, and the government was going to shut down unless that budget went through. And good lobbyists never let a crisis go to waste. So what happened was, in the midst of that must-pass budget bill, Monsanto and their friends got what was known inside the Beltway as the biotech rider attached to the budget bill, what activists came to call the Monsanto Protection Act. And what that rider said was that in a lawsuit where an advocacy organization, like I said before, there's a couple legal battles going on right now over GMO sugar beets and GMO alfalfa. Just back up and explain how this works. So biotech industry has to actually get USDA approval before they can plant a GMO crop, okay? There has to be certain steps that USDA goes through to ensure the safety of those crops for the environment. There's no safety requirements, by the way, for human safety, okay? The FDA does nothing to ensure the safety of GMO food. However, the USDA does have certain requirements for ensuring the safety of the environment when it comes to planting new GMO crops. Okay, so in several cases, Monsanto and other members of the biotech community have gotten stopped in court because the USDA didn't do its job. So, you know, biotech industry doesn't like that. So they essentially got an end run put into law that says the next time a court tells the USDA, you didn't make that decision properly, you needed to do a more thorough review, the USDA is required to ignore that court ruling. That's actually what this biotech rider accomplishes. In other words, you know, so the article I wrote about it, just to really flesh this out a little bit more, was called How Monsanto Teamed Up with Congress to Shred the Constitution. Okay, and if you've learned anything about how our government works, you might remember that there are three sectors of our government, right? The judicial branch, the executive branch, and the legislative branch. Separation of powers is a pretty key concept in our Constitution in order to allow for checks and balances. So in other words, if the executive branch, in this case the USDA, an agency under the executive branch, makes it the wrong decision, the judicial branch steps in and says, you did it wrong, go back to the drawing board, redo. Okay, what this new law says is USDA gets to ignore that and is required to allow the planting of these crops to go forward. I mean, that's why this is such a big deal. And it wasn't even brought out into the mainstream media right away. It wasn't until an activist group that I worked with called Food Democracy Now! Really just went crazy over this, and they do a lot of good work, and I recommend checking them out, to draw attention to this problem. They went to Washington, got over 300,000 people to sign a petition in protest, tried to get President Obama, believe it or not, to not sign the budget bill that, again, he had to sign or else the whole federal government would have shut down. Again, you know, no reason we should have even been in this crisis situation. The biotech industry had tried to get this measure passed last year, failed to do so, and then got it slipped into the budget bill. And you're right, no senator went through the Appropriations Committee. No senator took responsibility, was willing to admit that they slipped that measure in. A couple of members of Congress did protest to try and stop it, but it was too late. The only glimmer of hope is that, so what got passed was actually what's called the continuing resolution. They didn't pass the actual budget bill for next year. They just did a temporary version, which is only good for another 6 months. So technically, that crazy provision will be good for the rest of that continuing resolution and will expire at the end of that 6-month period. However, we certainly don't expect the biotech industry to stop there. We expect them to then try to attach it either to the next budget bill or some other, you know, piece of legislation where they can get it done permanently. Likely the next step would be it would be challenged in court, right? Because it's so crazy. I mean, even the USDA, the Secretary of USDA, Tom Vilsack, questioned whether it was constitutional. So it would likely be battled in court, taking several years to figure out, you know, whether that provision would be held up. But that's the state of affairs in Washington, D.C. these days.